Picture a 12-year-old boy standing in a dirt road in Michigan in the summer of 1876. In his pockets, watch parts, coils of spring, tiny gears, hairsprings thin as a whisper. He carries them everywhere. Neighbors have been bringing him their broken watches for years now, and he fixes every one. Not because anyone taught him, but because he cannot stop himself from understanding how things work. His mother died 3 months ago. She was 37. He described the house without her as a watch without a mainspring. He was 12 years old when he said that. Now he is standing at the edge of his father's farm, staring at something he has never seen before. A steam engine mounted on wheels, moving down the road under its own power. He jumps from his father's wagon before the old man even realizes what's happening. He runs to the machine. He circles it. He asks the operator everything. He will remember this moment in precise detail for the rest of his life. The farm is behind him. The machine is in front of him. And somewhere in that gap, between the life that was already written for him and the one he was already dreaming, he made a choice he probably couldn't even name yet. Now jump forward. The Ford Motor Company announces that every single worker on its assembly line will earn $5 a day. The financial editor of the New York Times staggers into his newsroom and asks his staff in a stunned whisper, "He's crazy, isn't he? Don't you think he's crazy?" Within a year, Henry Ford is the most famous man in America. Within a decade, his company is building 15 million cars. Within a generation, the Model T has ended the isolation of the American farm, built the American middle class, and changed the way every manufactured object on Earth is made. The boy who jumped off the wagon to look at that engine died in 1947 as one of the wealthiest human beings who had ever lived, in a house lit by candles and kerosene lamps, because the flood had cut the power, exactly as the farm he was born on had been lit 83 years before. This is not a simple success story. Before we are done, you will understand why. He built something unprecedented. He also nearly destroyed it, twice, with his own hands. He invented the American middle class and helped to fund the ideology that built the Holocaust. He believed more deeply than almost any man alive in the dignity of ordinary people, and he spent 30 years destroying the one person who loved him most. The question this story keeps asking, and not answering until the very end, is this: what does it actually mean to change the world? What does it cost, and who pays? We are going to find out. If you enjoy these stories, then support the channel by liking and subscribing. Thank you. And now, back to the gritty history. The watch without a mainspring. Henry Ford was born on July 30th, 1863, in a farmhouse in Springwells Township, Michigan, 9 miles outside Detroit, at the intersection of two roads that today bear the names Ford and Greenfield. Abraham Lincoln was president. The Civil War was 3 weeks past Gettysburg. The world Henry Ford was born into was a world of mud, muscle, and harvest cycles, and the expectation for a boy born into it was simple and total. You worked the land your father worked, and eventually your sons worked yours. His father, William Ford, was the son of Irish tenants who had fled County Cork during the potato famine of 1847. His mother, Mary Litigott, was the orphaned daughter of Belgian immigrants, adopted after her parents died by a neighboring Irish family called the O'Hearns. Both of his parents had come from nothing and built something modest and solid and respectable. William Ford's farm was not a poor farm, it was a prosperous one, which is part of the point. The trap Henry Ford was born into wasn't poverty, it was sufficiency. A good enough life, already decided, waiting for him like an inheritance he never asked for. From the time he could hold tools, Henry Ford was different. By 12, he had built himself a small machine shop in a shed on the farm property, equipped it himself, and was spending every spare minute in it. He carried watch parts in his pockets the way other boys carried marbles. Neighbors who hadn't been able to get a clock repaired in years started showing up at the Ford farm asking for the boy. He fixed everything they brought him, not because he was trying to earn money, because he genuinely could not understand why a broken thing should stay broken when the solution was right there inside it, waiting to be seen. What did Henry Ford want growing up on that farm? He wanted to understand how things worked, and then, more than that, he wanted to make them work better. He wrote later, "Even when I was very young, I suspected much farm work might somehow be done in a better way. That is what took me into mechanics. The farm wasn't the enemy. The waste was the enemy. The drudgery, the backbreaking inefficiency of a world that accepted hard labor as a permanent condition of human existence. That was what he would spend his entire life fighting." The summer of 1876 brought him two things that would shape everything that followed. The first, he saw a self-propelled steam engine moving down a road near Dearborn, operated by one man, moving under its own power. He later said it was this machine, this moment, that proved to him by instinct what he already suspected he was. An engineer, not a farmer, not his father's heir, an engineer. The second thing that summer brought him was grief. His mother, Mary, died on May 29th, 1876. She was 37 years old, a few days after delivering a stillborn child. Henry was 12. His father expected him to carry on. His siblings carried on. Henry Ford, by every account, was devastated in a way he never fully recovered from. Years later, he would describe the house after her death as a watch, without a mainspring, silent, still, a mechanism that has lost the thing that made it alive. Think about that metaphor for a moment. He was 12, and the language he reached for was mechanical. Not empty, not dark, not cold, a watch without a mainspring. Something that had been precise and purposeful had lost its animating force. It tells you everything about the way Henry Ford's mind worked. It also tells you everything about the size of what he lost. His father expected him to take over the farm. With his mother gone, Henry Ford had almost no reason to stay. 3 years later, in 1879, at age 16, he helped his father bring in the last summer harvest, did him that courtesy, and then he walked to Detroit. He left with nothing. No connections, no formal education beyond the 8th grade, no plan beyond the next machine shop, and the thing he already knew how to do better than almost anyone around him. The farm was behind him. He did not look back. But deciding to leave is easy, proving you were right to go, that would take another 24 years. 3 attempts, 2 failures, 1 idea that wouldn't die. When Henry Ford walked into Detroit in 1879, he was one kid among thousands flooding into America's industrial cities looking for work in the machine shops and factories that were beginning to reshape the country. His first job paid him $2.50 a week, shaping brass valves at the James F. Flower Brothers machine shop. He lived with his aunt. He was unknown, unconnected, and completely absorbed. What separated Ford from the other young men working those same shop floors wasn't genius in any flamboyant sense. It was obsession, combined with a peculiar quality of observation. He watched how things worked, and he watched where they failed, and he could not stop thinking about what he would do differently. He switched jobs when he felt he had learned everything one place could teach him. He read everything. He experimented, in the evenings on whatever he could get his hands on. By 1882, he was back on the farm, but not as a farmer. He had been hired by Westinghouse to service their portable steam engines across southern Michigan. He traveled, he worked, he tinkered. In winter, snowed in on the farm, he set up a machine shop and built a small tractor, a farm locomotive, he called it, that used a mowing machine chassis and a homemade steam engine. He was 20 years old. He had no money, no investors, no institution behind him, and he was already building things that had never existed. In 1888, he married Clara Bryant, a farmer's daughter from a few miles northeast of the Ford homestead. He had found the right person. Clara Bryant Ford would become, with no exaggeration, the difference between success and failure. not because she funded him or managed him, but because she believed in him with a steadiness that never wavered, through every setback, every sleepless night, every scheme that looked to the outside world like madness. He called her the believer. She earned it. In 1891, Ford and Clara moved back to Detroit. He joined the Edison Illuminating Company as an engineer. A good job, a respected job, a job with a future. He was promoted to chief engineer in 1893, the same month Clara gave birth to their son, Edsel. He had a salary of $125 a month, a family, a career, security, for the first time in his life, and he was already planning to throw it all away, because in the evenings and on weekends and in whatever stolen hour he could find, Ford was working on a gasoline-powered engine in the shed behind their house on Bagley Avenue. He wasn't the only person in America working on such a thing. There were dozens of inventors across the country doing the same, but Ford had a clarity that most of them didn't. He was not trying to build a curiosity. He was not trying to build a toy for the wealthy. He was trying to build something every person could use. In June 1896, he finished it. The quadricycle, 4 bicycle wheels on a buggy frame, a 4-horsepower engine, no reverse gear, steered with a tiller. He drove it through the streets of Detroit at 4 in the morning. He had to knock a hole in the shed wall to get it out because the door was too small. That detail matters. He built the thing before he figured out how to get it outside. He was always 3 steps ahead of the logistics. There's a meeting that year that Ford never forgot. The Edison Company held an executive gathering in New York, and Ford, the chief engineer from Detroit, found himself at a table with Thomas Edison himself. He described his gasoline engine experiments to Edison, who was nearly deaf. Edison leaned forward. He pounded the table. He said, "Young man, that's the thing. You have it. Keep at it." Ford later said Edison's approval was worth worlds to him. The Wizard of Menlo Park had told him he wasn't crazy. He had told him he was right. So what happened next? He quit the Edison Company. He sold the quadricycle for $200 and used the money to build another car. He found investors, most notably a Detroit lumber baron named William Murphy. And in August 1899, he co-founded the Detroit Automobile Company. He had a company. He had backing. He had a name on the door. What he didn't have was a product his investors were willing to wait for. The Detroit Automobile Company wanted to sell cars. Ford wanted to keep improving them. Every time they thought they had something ready for market, Ford would find something wrong with it and go back to the drawing board. The company produced virtually nothing. Murphy and the other investors lost patience. The company dissolved in 1901, roughly 18 months after it was founded. Henry Ford, at 37, had just burned his first company. But here is the thing about Henry Ford. Failure didn't humble him, it clarified him. He turned to racing. He believed that speed, visible, dramatic, undeniable speed, would prove what he already knew, that he could build an engine nobody else could match. In October 1901, he drove one of his own cars against Alexander Winton, then the most famous automobile manufacturer in America, on a track in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. Winton's engine began overheating. Ford caught him. Ford passed him. Ford won. This victory attracted new investors. By November 1901, they had formed the Henry Ford Company, his name on the door again, with Ford as chief engineer. He had a second chance, and then the investors did exactly what they had done before. They brought in an outside consultant, Henry M. Leland, a precision machinist of genuine brilliance, to design a passenger car for immediate production. The message was unmistakable. "We don't trust you to build what we need. We're going to put someone else in charge of your company while you watch." Ford walked out. He later wrote, "I resigned, determined never again to put myself under orders." The company bearing his name was reorganized. Leland took it over. He renamed it the Cadillac Automobile Company. Henry Ford, at 38, had now failed twice. 2 companies, 2 sets of investors, 2 attempts. He had walked away from a company with his own name above the door rather than build someone else's vision with his hands. He was broke, he was in Detroit, and his wife and young son were depending on him. The walkout was right. It was also the most terrifying thing he had ever done. Think about what it costs to do that. You are not young anymore. You have a family. The investor class of Detroit has now watched you torch two companies and both times walk away blaming them. The most dangerous thing in the world at this moment is your own stubbornness. Everyone around you can see it, and you cannot stop. What he did instead was go back to racing. He built the most powerful car he had ever attempted, the 999-80 horsepower, a machine so violent that Ford himself refused to drive it in competition. He hired a former bicycle racer named Barney Oldfield, who had never driven a car in his life, and said, "Here are the controls, good luck." Oldfield drove it to a record-breaking victory over a 3-mile course in October 1902. Ford's name was everywhere. This attracted a Detroit coal dealer named Alexander Malcolmson. Malcolmson believed in Ford, specifically and personally. He became the backer Ford had been looking for, a man who would let Ford build what Ford was trying to build. On June 16, 1903, they opened the Ford Motor Company. 12 investors, $28,000 in cash. No factory of their own, they contracted with the Dodge brothers, John and Horace, to supply components. The first cars were assembled by hand by groups of 2 or 3 men in a leased building on Mack Avenue in Detroit. By July 1903, the company was nearly bankrupt again. They had spent almost all of their capital. There were no cars in customers' hands yet. There was nothing to show. And then they sold one. An $850 Model A, 8 horsepower, 2 cylinders, then they sold 2 more and took deposits on them. 3 cars was enough. They stayed alive. By the end of the year, they had sold 1,700 cars, and the company was profitable. The third attempt had held. But what Henry Ford built with that survival wasn't just a car company. It was a declaration, and the world was about to find out what he was actually declaring. A car for the great multitude. Here is what Henry Ford believed, stated simply and without sentiment. Ordinary people deserve to move freely through the world, not just wealthy people, not just people who could afford a horse and a stable hand. Every person, the farmer in Georgia who had never been more than 10 miles from where he was born, the machinist in Detroit who took the streetcar because nothing else was available, every one of them. Ford wanted to build the machine that would set them loose. This belief was, in 1903, considered either naive or insane, depending on who you asked. Automobiles at that time were hand-built luxury objects, expensive to buy, expensive to maintain, and almost impossible for an ordinary person to repair when they broke down, which they did constantly. The automobile was a toy for the rich. Everyone knew this. Ford disagreed. He spent the next 5 years building toward a single idea. In October 1908, he introduced the Model T. It cost $850. It was a 4-cylinder car, 20 horsepower, built with a new high-grade vanadium steel that Ford's own engineers had helped develop, lighter and tougher than anything else on the market. It was designed to be repaired by the owner with ordinary tools. The magneto was built right into the flywheel, no separate battery to drain or fail. The engine was designed so that any reasonably competent person could take it apart in a field. Ford specifically wanted the American farmer to be able to fix it himself with parts available at any hardware store. In its first year, Ford sold 10,607 Model Ts, and then the number kept growing, and growing, and growing. But how do you build that many cars? That was the question Ford spent the next 5 years obsessively answering. The old method was craftwork. Skilled mechanics building cars from parts, working in one place, finishing one car before moving to the next. Ford hated this, not because the mechanics weren't skilled, they were, but because the process was grotesquely inefficient. Time was wasted. People walked from tool to tool when the tools should come to them. A car that sat still while work happened to it was a car that was wasting the single most precious resource in any manufacturing operation: time. His answer was the moving assembly line introduced at the Highland Park plant in December 1913. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. The car moves, the workers stay still. Each person does one thing over and over as the line moves past them. Parts, subassemblies, and components arrive with precise timing. The chassis moves, the engine drops in, the body goes on. The car exits the building complete. Before the assembly line, a Model T took 12.5 hours to build. After, 93 minutes. Not a marginal improvement, a transformation. Production soared. And as production soared, costs collapsed. And as costs collapsed, Ford cut the price. The Model T that cost $850 in 1908 cost $490 in 1913. By 1924, it cost $290. By 1927, it had fallen to $260, as wages were rising. Eventually, one Model T came off the line every 24 seconds. Ford once said his goal was to build a car so cheap that no man who earns a good salary will be unable to own one and enjoy with his family the blessing of hours of pleasure in God's great open spaces. He was not talking about rich men. He was talking about the man on the line. But the line had a problem. The assembly line made cars faster. It also made work miserable. Workers who had taken pride in craftsmanship were now doing the same single task over and over, every minute, every day. No variation, no skill expression, no end to the repetition. By late 1913, Ford's labor turnover rate was 370%. He was essentially hiring and training an entirely new workforce 3 times a year. People couldn't take it. They quit. On January 5th, 1914, Ford and his Vice President James Couzens made an announcement that sent shockwaves through every industrial city on the planet. Ford Motor Company would pay every eligible worker $5 a day for an 8-hour shift. This was more than double the going rate. The New York Times financial editor reportedly staggered into his newsroom asking if Henry Ford had lost his mind. Within days, 10,000 men had lined up outside the Highland Park plant in January, cold looking for a job. The $5 day worked, exactly as Ford said it would. Turnover disappeared, the workforce stabilized, the most skilled mechanics in Detroit came to Ford, productivity improved, and Ford's profits, which had already been enormous, doubled again within 2 years. But there was more to it than that. Ford had understood something about the economics of mass production that most industrialists hadn't thought through. The owner, the employees, and the buying public are all one and the same, he wrote later. If you pay people enough to buy what they make, you create the customers you need to keep building what you're selling. The $5 day didn't just stabilize his workforce. It helped create the market that his factory was producing for. The New York Times called Ford the most famous man in America by January 14, 1914, 9 days after the announcement. He was 49 years old and had been obscure for nearly 40 years. Now he was everywhere. His face, his opinions, his methods, the whole world wanted to know what Henry Ford was doing and why. By 1914, Ford Motor Company was selling 308,000 Model Ts a year, more than every other automobile manufacturer in the world combined. By the early 1920s, Ford commanded over 50% of the U.S. automobile market. The River Rouge plant, begun in 1915, sprawled across 229 acres with 42,000 workers and 93 miles of internal railroad track. Iron ore came in one end, a finished automobile came out the other. So, what does that actually mean? In human terms, not balance sheet terms. What does it mean when one man's obsession reshapes not just an industry, but the daily texture of millions of lives? One Georgia farm wife wrote to Henry Ford in 1918, "You know, Henry, your car lifted us out of the mud." That letter sat in Ford's files for the rest of his life. When Ford left the farm in 1879, 2 out of 8 Americans lived in cities. When he died, it was 5 out of 8. The automobile didn't just move people from place to place. It ended the age-old isolation of the American countryside. It built the suburbs. It remade the relationship between human beings and distance itself. The horse disappeared so fast that the transfer of farmland from hay to other crops caused its own agricultural revolution. Henry Ford had not just built a business, he had rewired the world. But here is the question that the numbers can't answer, and it's the one that matters most. What happens to a man who rewires the world? What does that kind of certainty, the certainty that turned out to be right about everything, do to him when it turns? When the same stubbornness that built the empire starts to become the thing that eats it? We are about to find out. The sun. He couldn't stop destroying. The signs were there in the early 1920s if you were willing to look. The Model T was 15 years old. General Motors, under a former industrial executive named Alfred Sloan, had reorganized itself around a new idea, a car for every purse and purpose. Not one car for everyone, but multiple cars for multiple kinds of people, each with annual updates, choice of color, modern features, and available on a payment plan. Sloan was building a ladder. Ford was still selling a single rung. By the mid-1920s, Chevrolet was directly competing with the Model T on price while offering things the Model T didn't have: a water pump, a proper starter, hydraulic brakes, colors other than black. Ford's share of the market, once over 50%, began to slide. The people who worked for Henry Ford could see it. The people who worked with him tried to say it. In 1926, a Ford vice president named Ernest Kanzler wrote a formal memo to Henry Ford, careful, respectful, backed with data, arguing that the Model T needed to be replaced. Ford's response was immediate. "That young man," he said, "is getting too big for his britches." He fired Kanzler. Edsel Ford, who had been president of the Ford Motor Company since 1919, tried too. Edsel was 25 when his father gave him the title of president. He had grown up inside this company, loved it, understood it in ways that were different from his father's, more aesthetic, more attuned to what customers actually wanted. He argued for hydraulic brakes. Henry Ford shouted him down at a board meeting. He argued for design updates. Henry Ford dismissed him in front of his own employees. He argued that the Model T was dying and that they needed to build something new before it was too late. His father would not hear it. Now ask yourself what that costs a man. To be the president of a company in name while your father overrules every significant decision you make, to watch the damage happening in real time and be powerless to stop it, to have the authority without the power, the title without the trust. Edsel Ford was not a weak man. He was doing exactly what anyone with eyes and sense would do. He was right about every single thing he said, and his father broke him for it. Ford's market share continued to fall. Finally, in May 1927, the evidence became impossible to ignore, even for Henry Ford. He announced that the Model T would be discontinued. 2 days later, the 15 millionth rolled off the line, a record for a single model that stood for 45 years until the Volkswagen Beetle surpassed it. It was a genuine achievement, staggering in scale. Ford marked it by shutting down his entire production operation for months while his plants were retooled. Tens of thousands of workers lost their jobs during the transition. His comment on the whole situation: "The only thing wrong with that car was that people stopped buying it." Even then, even with the evidence of what his stubbornness had cost everyone around him, he still didn't understand. There is more. In 1919, Ford had purchased a weekly newspaper called the Dearborn Independent. Over the next several years, he used it to publish 91 consecutive weeks of virulently anti-Semitic articles, which were compiled and distributed globally under the title The International Jew. The book was translated into 16 languages. It was read in Germany by a young political movement that was looking for intellectual validation for its hatreds. Baldur von Schirach, leader of the Hitler Youth, testified at the Nuremberg trials that the decisive book informing his anti-Semitic worldview was Henry Ford's The International Jew. Hitler kept a portrait of Ford in his Munich office. In 1938, on Ford's 75th birthday, the Nazi government awarded him the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest honor Germany could bestow on a foreign national. Ford accepted it. These are facts about the man who built the American middle class. They sit alongside the $5 day and the Model T and the moving assembly line. You do not get to choose which parts of a person to count. You take them whole, or you take nothing. Back to Edsel. Through the 1930s, Edsel Ford was the reason the company survived. He pushed through the 1928 Model A, which replaced the T and temporarily restored Ford's position. He modernized the Lincoln Line. He launched the Mercury. He commissioned Diego Rivera to paint the Detroit Industry murals, vast, stunning frescoes on the walls of the Detroit Institute of Arts that depicted the River Rouge workers as the titans they were. He was, by every measure, a better custodian of the company than his father had been in the previous decade, and his father undermined him at every turn. Promoted Harry Bennett, a thuggish former Navy boxer who ran Ford's service department as a private security force over Edsel's authority. Used Bennett to enforce his will across the company through intimidation and fear. When UAW organizers attempted to distribute leaflets at the overpass near River Rouge in May 1937, Bennett's men beat them in full view of press, photographers. The images went around the world. Walter Reuther, bloodied on the concrete. Ford Motor Company was the last of the Detroit automakers to recognize the United Auto Workers, and only did so when the federal government forced the issue. Edsel Ford, watching all of this, developed ulcers. The stress of fighting his father on every front while nominally holding the title of president was eating him alive, literally. By 1943, he was seriously ill with stomach cancer, and he was drinking unpasteurized milk from a Ford farm to soothe the pain. Milk that may have introduced undulant fever on top of everything else. He was 49 years old. He died on May 26, 1943. Some of the people who knew him best said it plainly. Henry Ford bullied his son to death. Not in a single act, but in 1,000 daily acts of control and dismissal and humiliation across 20 years. The man who had given freedom to the American road had been unable even once to let his own son drive. Henry Ford, now 80, resumed control of the company. He was not well. A series of strokes in the late 1930s had left him diminished, and the people around him, Bennett foremost among them, had begun to run the company according to their own interests. By 1945, losses were mounting. Bankruptcy was a genuine possibility. The company that Ford had built from nothing was lurching toward the end. And then 2 women stopped it. Clara Ford, his wife, and Eleanor Ford, Edsel's widow, arranged a confrontation with the old man. They told him directly, hand control to Henry Ford II, Edsel's son, 28 years old, or they would sell their stock, 3/4 of the company's total shares, and he would lose the company entirely. Henry Ford was reportedly furious. He had no choice. He yielded. Henry Ford II's first act as company president was to fire Harry Bennett. The empire survived. But think about what it had cost to get there. The son destroyed, the workers surveilled, and beaten. A generation of prejudice with real blood on its hands, in Europe, in the death camps, in the pages of a newspaper Ford had bought and filled with poison. The company saved not by Henry Ford's vision, but by the 2 women who loved what he had built enough to fight him for it. He had built something extraordinary. He had also been willing to burn it to the ground rather than admit he was wrong. What the farm boy proved, and what it cost. Henry Ford died on April 7, 1947. He was 83 years old. The cause was a cerebral hemorrhage, the last and most serious in a series of strokes that had diminished him across the final decade of his life. The night he died, the Rouge River flooded the grounds of Fairlane, his 1,200-acre estate in Dearborn, and cut the electrical power to the house. His wife Clara and the household staff who were with him lit candles and kerosene lamps to see. He died in the same quality of light as the farmhouse where he had been born. 83 years before, the same flickering, the same smell of burning oil, the same darkness beyond the flame. The wheel had turned all the way around. Take a moment to understand the scale of what was being mourned. 15 million Model Ts, an assembly line that had reduced a car from 12.5 hours to 93 minutes and been replicated in every manufacturing industry on Earth. The $5 day that had made the American working class into the American consuming class. The $5 automobile price by 1927. From $850 to $260, achieved through 20 years of relentless efficiency. One car every 24 seconds, 42,000 workers at River Rouge alone. When he walked away from the farm in 1879, 2 out of 8 Americans lived in cities. When he died, 5 out of 8 did. He didn't cause all of that, but the machine he built, and the roads that machine demanded, and the suburbs those roads made possible, and the economy those suburbs fed. Henry Ford was at the center of the largest single restructuring of how human beings live in the history of the country. Fortune magazine named him Businessman of the Century in 1999. Not of the decade, not of the era, the century. He left most of his personal fortune, estimated in 1947 at roughly $200 million, to the Ford Foundation, which became one of the largest and most influential charitable organizations in the world dedicated to democracy, poverty reduction, and human advancement. His great-granddaughter, Josephine Ford, gave more than $10 million to the Henry Ford Health System. The Ford family's philanthropic legacy eventually dwarfed the controversies in scale, if not in moral weight. But here is what you need to sit with, because the story doesn't let you look away from it. The man who invented the American middle class, who paid workers double the going rate because he believed they deserved to afford the things they built, also published the intellectual framework that the Nazi movement used to justify the Holocaust. These two facts are not separate. They belong to the same person, the same certainty, the same absolute conviction that he alone understood how the world worked and what was wrong with it, the same quality that built everything, expressed itself as generosity toward the assembly line worker and as virulent hatred toward a group he had decided, without evidence and against all reason, was the enemy of the world he was building. Baldur von Schirach said it under oath at Nuremberg. We do not get to pretend he didn't. And his son. Edsel Ford was 49 when he died. He had spent 30 years trying to modernize the company his father was strangling. He was right about every major call he made: the Model A, the Lincoln, the Mercury, hydraulic brakes, annual model updates, worker unionization, the war effort, every single one. Henry Ford II, the grandson who saved the company, was building on Edsel's legacy, not Henry's. The empire that endured was Edsel's vision, realized after Edsel's death by Edsel's son. The father who walked away from the farm because no one was going to tell him who to be, became the father who could not stop telling his son exactly who he was. Now, return to that road in Michigan. 1876. The boy running to the machine, watch parts in his pockets, the farm behind him, the steam engine in front of him, one man standing on a platform, operating this massive, impossible thing by himself, in motion, under his own power. Something alive that had no right to be alive, something moving that nothing had moved before. He spent his whole life chasing that feeling. The feeling of the impossible made actual, the feeling of the machine that defied what the world said was possible. He put it in the hands of 15 million people who had never known that feeling before. He changed what ordinary human life could be. The bill for that, as it turned out, was not payable in money. The boy from the farm who never wanted to farm, who taught himself everything, who walked to Detroit with nothing and failed twice and kept going, He changed the world. That part is simple, and it is true, and it will never stop being true. The rest of it is also true. All of it. The whole enormous, contradictory, brilliant, broken man. That is what it cost. He gave America the road. What he did with the rest of it, that's a harder story.